and can be the epicenter of healing for the entire United States on slavery and white supremacy. We can all agree that we need a reset on the Alamo and Alamo Plaza. But today, we can mark our city as an epicenter of healing. After what we saw on the Capitol with the sedition, with a president who named his campaign Operation Alamo, we can be a center for healing in the United States. And I believe we have to take a different tact. I believe that we've got to stop dealing with this like a tribe and start dealing like a human family. Like a human family. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family. A few mistakes we've made and how we've become better people by acknowledging the past, understanding the truth, and reconciling to be better as individuals. My family on my mother's side were some of the first settlers in East Texas. A picture of Godfrey Ellisor, who is white and our slave master, but is also my great-great-grandfather, has sat in my mother's house almost all of my life. We have a white, a Native American, and a black side on her family. Godfrey Ellisor arrived from Europe to South Carolina and traveled through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then was one of the first settlers in East Texas to a small area by the woodlands called New Waverly. He had a baby by my great-great-grandmother, Mandy Ellisor, his slave. And to them was born Ben Ellisor, half white and half black. Papa Ben, as my mother would call him, met a Native American girl named Callie on the first reservation in Texas, founded in part with the help of Sam Houston, the Alabama Coshada Reservation by Lake Livingston. My great-grandmother Callie was full Native American, and during the family reunion 3 years ago, they passed around an article from the local paper in East Texas acknowledging my family's roots in the founding of Texas, which included the fact that the Caddo Indians had been in Texas over 200 years BC. That's over 2,200 years. And from our tribe's language, the Caddo Hasinai, we gave Texas its name, which is from the Caddo Native American word, which means friend. Several years ago, I took my ancestry DNA test and was connected with relatives on my mother's side who had put together pieces of the white side of our family that I had never seen. I would learn about relatives of mine who fought in the American Revolution. And then one day, for the very first time, I would see a picture of Gottfried and his brothers and an image that actually sent chills through me and fear through me. It was an image of a Confederate flag. And I clicked on the link, and through the research, I learned that Gottfried had fought in the Confederate Army. I said, I'll be damned. I've got relatives who fought in both the American Revolution and the Confederate Army. I thought I was going to need some of Senator Gutierrez's. Here I had developed a track record of fighting for freedom. I was ahead of the group in Boston, led America's leading anti-trafficking organization, where we fought genocide around the world. I went into the bloodiest civil war in the 20th century on 3 occasions to free over 6,000 people from human bondage. I had helped be a freedom fighter, helping to start 2 of the world's newest countries in partnership with George Bush and the Congress. By passing the Sudan Peace Act, we got independence for South Sudan, and eventually we put sanctions on the dictatorship in Myanmar, it became Burma, and they became a more free country. Here I was looking at this as someone who, here at the courthouse, had removed the Confederate symbols on this courthouse and put them in the Institute of Texan Cultures in a museum where they could have proper context and proper history. And I said, I'll be damned if someone on my mama's mantle fought in the Confederacy. All of you have to know that all you have to do to know that Godfrey and his blood runs through mine is to look at me. Look at me. And you can see my ancestry is mixed. When I was a junior in high school at St. Mary's Hall, I was walking toward the front carport of the school, and I saw a woman carrying boxes. And I asked the woman, I said, "Can I help you carry those boxes?" She was a white lady. She said, "Sure, thank you." And so I helped her carry them, and she said, "What's your name?" I said, "I'm Tommy Calvert." She said, "I'm Shirley Ellisor." I said, "Oh, my mother's maiden name is Ellisor." She goes, "Oh, really? Where's your mother from?" I said, "My mother's from East Texas." She said, "My husband's from East Texas. Where's your mother from?" I said, "My mother's from a small town called New Waverly." She said, "My husband is from New Waverly." I looked at her and said, "What's up, cuz?" The black side and the white side of our family had long ago reconciled to know each other. I didn't know her, but we were related. But we reconciled to be friendly and kind to each other. My great-grandfather Ben was given land by Gottfried, and Papa Ben ended up being the principal in the school and giving land for the construction of the Church of God in Christ. He was impressive for his time. My mother never taught me to hate white people because we were enslaved by them. We knew the truth. We reconciled to live no differently than the Golden Rule demanded. We understood our family history, but common sense told us not to glorify the things that Godfrey did wrong, like fight in the Confederacy. That we don't celebrate. We know he was in the Confederate Army now, but we do not celebrate being on the wrong side of history. We aim to dedicate our family to making sure that we never again allow our neighbors to be treated any differently than we would want to be treated ourselves. And that means we have to recognize each other's humanity. We have to recognize each other's history and the lessons life teaches us to grow to be more united and at peace as a human family. I'm here to tell you that no matter what you've learned over the years, there is no race but the human race. There's no black, there's no white, there's no brown. We are all the human race. And our lives are much more enriched by getting to know each other, finding our truths, and reconciling to turn a new chapter in our pursuit to live in peace as a human family. The truth of our Texas history is that President Guerrero of Mexico was mulatto, meaning part black and Spanish, and he abolished slavery in Mexico. The two great energies in the world are love and fear. Guerrero shared his love for all by seeking freedom for all. The Texans feared that they would lose their financial way of life and that the doctrine would apply to Texas. Santa Anna's army did march into Texas, freeing slaves. Stephen F. Austin was from Missouri, and he reached out to large slaveholding owners across the country, people like my great-great-grandparents, and gave them oversized tracts of land, and through his slave rules, helped to settle a slave system in Texas. The empire of cotton and slavery had been very lucrative, and it was threatened by Santa Anna in 1835 and 1836. Commander Travis sold a slave on Christmas Day. James Bowie was one of the biggest slave traders on the Louisiana-Texas border. They were capturing slave ships and bringing them to New Orleans, and as someone who helped write the laws on human trafficking in 2002, and created the first $50 million to fight slavery since Reconstruction. I believe it was an organized crime syndicate that wanted to make sure that those profits didn't slip away when Santa Anna invaded. Article 9 of the 1836 Constitution said, and I quote, "All persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude, provide the said slave shall be the bona fide property of the person so holding said slave aforesaid. Congress shall pass no law to prohibit immigrants from the United States of America from bringing their slaves into the Republic with them and holding them by the same tenure by which such slaves were held in the United States. Nor shall Congress have power to emancipate slaves, nor shall any slaveholder be allowed to emancipate his or her slave or slaves without the consent of Congress, unless he or she shall send his or her slave or slaves without the limits of the Republic. No free person of African descent, either in whole or in part, shall be permitted to reside permanently in the Republic without the consent of Congress, and the importation or admission of Africans or Negroes into the Republic, excepting from the United States of America, is forever prohibited and declared to be piracy." Any historian who isn't going to be laughed out of academia and popular culture has to be able to use primary sources to contextualize historical events. On May 2nd, 1836, in an article in the Connecticut Current, printed Santa Anna's order in support of President Guerrero's decrees to abolish slavery in 1829. The decree said, quote, "In compliance with said laws, the persons of all colored people of both sexes are from this moment declared free, and this whatever may be of nature of the contracts which bind them to their masters, should said contracts be in a direct or indirect manner contrary to the existing prohibitory laws of the Republic of Mexico and slave trade, in which case they shall be considered as null and of no value." And herein we have the controversy that few people wanted to talk about. Herein its unfortunate simplicity of a 1960s movie about the Alamo has misinformed many white Americans of the reality of what happened. So when Kate Rogers said something that I have never heard an Alamo director state, which is, quote, "I have studied controversial historical sites and how they are dealing with changing the conversations around those sites, and that a lot of good can come about with the redevelopment plan of the Alamo. I had the beginning of a conversation aimed toward truth and reconciliation. I believe that the story of the Alamo henceforth must be headed towards all Texans' fight for freedom as a unifying message. I worried when the court hastily took up the Alamo Museum dollars, the controversy might be too divisive, but I know that having a director willing to add historians like Professor Salas, who is on the other end of the dais, like Dr. Philip Tucker, who wrote Exodus from the Alamo, The Anatomy of the Last Stand Myth, which Kate Rogers agreed to do, is a major shift in the right direction of the conversation. The fact that the county could tie the $25 million, and did tie the $25 million, to telling the real story, to the exhibits in the Woolworth Building, is an important shift in the dialogue. Science and DNA can reveal black relatives of Alamo defenders. We can't hide it any more than Thomas Jefferson and his ancestors. And I want us to learn that different Texans struggled for freedom. I want to acknowledge the African Lancers who were part of Santa Anna's army that fought the last defenders of the Alamo, who some ran out the back and were killed in the parking lot of what is now Denny's. I want to acknowledge other Texans' fight for freedom, like Mrs. Brackenridge, who led the Texas fight for women's suffrage and became the first woman registered to vote in Texas. and the first in Bexar County, so that women like Helen Dutmer and Cindy Taylor and Trish DeBerry and Rebecca Clay Flores can serve on the Commissioner's Court. I want to acknowledge Texans' fight for freedom, like Lyndon Baines Johnson, who passed away in San Antonio at Brooke Army Medical Center, but ushered through the Voting Rights Act to expand freedom, and other civil rights pioneers like Reverend Black, and even a young man like me who was born off of Martin Luther King Boulevard on the East Side and became a voice for freedom and democracy around the world. So many men have caused so many wars, and I have to praise Kate Rogers, the Alamo director, who through her integrity and smarts are what can bring this community together. She isn't alone in that. I know that people like Aranetta Pierce, Tony Edwards, Mario Salas, even Rosie Castro are willing to help her. But let's not drop the microphone when other voices are talking. I spoke earlier about two prevailing forces in the world, love and fear. Fear would have said, I'm not going to support giving $25 million for the Alamo Museum because I fear that the establishment of this city would do what they've always done, hide the truth. But hope and love told me that people like Kate Rogers, who is of the highest integrity, people along with many of you here in this room, a family together, give us an opportunity to do what South Africa did. Allow the community to tell the truth. Allow the community to reconcile what was done. And as Kate said, do good with the project, to close the chapter on the past and turn a new page where we are all read about in the struggle for freedom in Texas. This wasn't easy, and it's not easy, but it's what this community must do, and it's why I supported the $25 million commitment for this process. It's already unanimously approved and amended by the court with strong insurances. We made history and turned history towards our better angels. Numerous controversial historical locations are addressing their controversies head on. Visitors still come. The tourism and business community don't need to freak out that suddenly tourism will stop. Tourists will always come to San Antonio because of how you treat them, because of how we treat them. We welcome them with friendship. We welcome them as a family, much like my Caddo Native American ancestors greeted early Texas settlers, calling this the land of our friends. It's time that we live up to that name. And even if the committees today don't live up to that challenge, I believe there will be future historians who will make right on the record. So I think we all need to give the reset a chance. As an abolitionist, it wasn't an easy thing to do, to vote for that. But as a person of faith, it was the right thing to do. Faith, hope, and love. But of all of these, the greatest is love. We are commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves. The Alamo Trust must turn the chapter to one of our human family and not one of one tribe. It's time to put Jesus back in the church at the Alamo. So I hope we move forward tonight in healing. Let us move forward in truth, for the truth shall set us free. Those who are trying to engage in cancel culture, where we cannot hear each other out, are following through on un-American dictatorial actions. And this community can never stand for that. They fear the truth. They fear that the way things may go mean that somehow they lose something. I can assure you from my own family history that there is a lot more beauty to our lives when we handle things as a human family. We may not like the things members of our family do, but we seek to learn to do better with the opportunities afforded to future generations. I believe that is our reset. I believe that is our charge. I believe the leadership to be up to the challenge So I pray that we move forward in peace. And let us move forward, as my Caddo Native American ancestors said, as friends, as Texans. I'd now like to introduce Brian Burrow. He's the author of 6 books, including The Big Rich, Days of Rage, Public Enemies, and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Barbarians at the Gate. Please give him a big round of applause.
So, hey y'all, thanks for coming. It's not really an event that we put together, but we're happy to be here and honored that people would actually come show up and talk about the community and ideas, old and new. This started off in such a different way. None of this was supposed to happen. We were writing a book that nobody'd ever heard of or was ever going to hear of. This was supposed to be a lark that 3 pals were going to do in their spare time. And Chris had this idea over breakfast one morning on South Congress Avenue in Austin. And I guess we weren't paying enough attention to something he was saying about his latest column. And so he actually said, everything you think you know about the Alamo, he'd been talking about the Alamo for a few minutes by then, everything you think you know about the Alamo is a lie. And I realized he was an overstatement to effect to get us to pay attention to what he was saying. And he threw off some examples, and then he talked about the impact that the Alamo story had on a lot of Tejanos. This was entirely new to me. I was a 58-year-old Anglo guy, had spent 30 years up in New York, had a pair of come-and-take-it socks, and that was about all I knew about Alamo history or Texas history since 7th grade. And so we went off and did this book, and it pains me to find myself sometimes in venues like this where so much of what we're discussing and listening to is informed by people's politics and not the facts of history. Our book was not supposed to be a book of politics. I'm not particularly political. I certainly don't have any political views on any of this. I'm interested in history and provocative history and exploring new ways to think about history and new ideas. I'm not naive. None of us were. We knew we would end up in a political place. I think having spent 30 years in New York, I probably didn't realize quite how political it was. And now we wake up finding ourselves being held up by people on both coasts as some type of heroes of the First Amendment, which if I don't think we are, we're just kind of blundered into Texas politics. It's just kind of an iceberg we hit. I am struck by this book. We're very proud of it, but it's not perfect. As I got into the book and began trying to test out a lot of theses of what was true, what was not, what was debatable, I found an enormous amount of comfort in the fact that there's been a tremendous amount of new scholarship on everything we write about in the last 30 or 40 years. And I came to realize that really what our book was going to do was going to attempt to summarize everything that these super smart academics at UT and A&M and University of Houston and Rice had been thinking and over these years, and that our value, if you would be to take all this scholarship and try to present it to a popular audience, regular people who don't spend their time immersed in university libraries. And there are some people who get that and some people that don't. One of my favorite reviews of all the reviews we've gotten was from Bill Brands, the noted UT professor in the Washington Post, whose main point seems to be, there's nothing new here. We've been saying this stuff for 30 years. Come on. In fact, he said we were beating a dead horse by going on about this revisionist stuff. Everybody knows this. Don't you realize that? And I think our feeling was, oh, okay, a little condescending, but no, not everybody knows that. Frankly, I think a lot of this is still surprising to a lot of people. It was a surprise to my mom and dad, who I always test my views out on. Then there was the guy, the other professor in the Fort Worth paper, who basically said, I don't understand why people are getting so stirred up about this. In academia, this has all been known for 3 or 4 decades. all these guys are doing is essentially repeating what we've said. I'd like to believe that we built on that. There's considerable, new stuff, new material that we're proud of in the book. But there is something to be said for that we're building on a firm, foundation of what's been out there. I say it's not a perfect book. None of my books have been perfect. If any of you have ever picked up Barbarians of the Gate, especially the first edition, you'll love that moment when I talked about a crew of investment bankers taking a cab up Fifth Avenue. Anybody know what goes down? Enemy. It's taking a cab across the Golden Gate Bridge to interrogate somebody who knew Babyface Nelson in 1934. Problem, Golden Gate Bridge not built till 1935. I say this because we have a similar number of small things that we've cleaned up. Blame me for saying Seguin was north of San Antonio. I'm pretty sure that's on me. We managed to fix everything that we saw in the second printing. We were lucky enough to get a third printing, and we cleaned up a couple of footnotes as well. So it's not a perfect book, but it's a book that we're very proud of. Each of us worked all across the book, but by and large, I took the lead on the first third or so, most of the history that goes from the early years up until the end of the battle. Chris took the lead on the second part of the book, which is the story of the Alamo story, basically 1836 up till the 1960s, up till the John Wayne movie and LBJ. And Jason got the really fun stuff, which was everything that's happened, almost all of it in San Antonio since 1980, which meant while we were able to mostly immerse ourselves in libraries and conference rooms and books, it was Jason and Chris in the end who spent an awful lot of time talking to an awful lot of smart politicians, businessmen, activists, and people who have been involved in all these events. I've talked too long, but I just want to say again, it's a real honor that so many people would show up tonight. It's a real testament to the community spirit here and how people care about these ideas and this history. So thanks. I hope we don't disappoint you with any place we go tonight.
I'm going to let Mario Salas introduce Chris Tomlinson. I think you've got his bio over there, don't you? I want you to introduce Chris Tomlinson.
Well, Chris Tomlinson is a columnist for the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, and the author of New York Times best-selling Tomlinson Hill about his family's slave-owning history in Texas. From 1995 to 2007, he reported from more than 30 countries and 9 wars for the Associated Press. Please welcome Chris Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mario. And Commissioner, it's remarkable for someone I've just met 45 minutes ago. We share so much. My first book, Tomlinson Hill, was about my family's slave plantation outside of Marlin, Texas, and it was a similarly myth-busting project. I grew up believing in the myth of the good slaveholder. Anyone who can trace their ancestry, any Anglo person who can trace their ancestry back to a slave plantation has probably heard a variation of the story. Yeah, slavery was bad, but our ancestors were the good slaveholders, right? I covered the end of apartheid in South Africa. I went to these plantations in KwaZulu-Natal, and I saw what really struck me as what my family's slave plantation must have looked like. You have, workers living in mud huts with thatched roofs with no running water and pit latrines, while the wealthy white family lives in a big mansion on the hill, this beautifully manicured yard. And I thought to myself, these people are not slaves, but their life isn't much better than if they were living in slavery. And there's nothing good about this. And I began to think, no, there's no such thing as a good slaveholder. So I came back to Texas after covering 9 wars, including the war in southern Sudan, witnessing the release. In fact, you and I may have been at the same place and just not known it, the release of enslaved people in southern Sudan. I covered the genocide in Rwanda. I walked through fields with tens of thousands of dead bodies, and I understood what ethnic hatred looked like. I went to Somalia, where you have the most ethnically, religiously homogenous culture on the planet. The only way these people tell each other apart is by sub-clan, by who their cousins are, and they will kill each other based on whose cousin is whose. And I learned that it's about power and it's about privilege. You can say the genocide in Rwanda was about atavistic ethnic hatreds. No, it was about power and privilege. It was that way too in Burundi and in Somalia and in northern Uganda and southern Sudan. It was that way between Ethiopia and Eritrea. It was even that way when I was covering the Sunni uprising in Fallujah and Ramadi in Iraq, or when I was at the Battle of Tora Bora. I learned that there are many different things that cause wars. There are many different levels. And oftentimes what the leader says and what the young man with the rifle believes are 2 different things. And even they may not know what the real reason was behind the scenes. That's the reality of human conflict. And I've seen it firsthand. I've also been in combat in all 9 of those situations. I am a former soldier and a veteran. So I know a little something about hand-to-hand fighting because I've witnessed it. I've watched people killed in front of me. It's not what you think it is. It's not glorious. There's nothing honorable about someone's blood being splattered across a room. And I see a lot of veterans here, and I see a combat infantryman's badge right over there. And I know he will tell you the same thing, because he's seen it too. So when I set out to write this book, as a columnist for the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, I get a lot of hate mail, a lot of it. I mean, I've got people who read everything I write and take 15 minutes out of their day to tell me how stupid and dumb I am. And I can't understand why they keep reading, but they do. It gives them some sense of purpose in the world to get up in the morning and tell Chris Tomlinson how dumb he is. So I think I had a little better idea of what we were getting into. The column that kind of spurred all this was when I was thinking about San Antonio's brand. You know, I see the Alamo facade over all these signs all over town. And I'm thinking that's really an important part of San Antonio's brand, but what underlies that brand? And what does that brand mean when only 41% of the Texas population is Anglo? What does that brand mean in 2025 when the majority of this state's going to be Hispanic? Are these old myths based in white supremacy going to survive? Should they survive? Or do they even exist in these communities? Because, you know, one of the things I learned in working on this book and conducting a lot of interviews with people here in San Antonio is they've known that their families have known the true story all along, and no one ever listened to them. And I'm looking at you, Mario. I'm looking at you. So my part of the book was to look at this myth-making, because that's what I did with Tomlinson Hill. I had immersed myself in 19th century, early 20th century Texas politics and history. I realized that the Daughters of the Republic of Texas had an agenda. I realized that Clara Driscoll was perhaps not the heroine that people think she was, but neither was Adina de Zavala, frankly, whose the DE suddenly went from a lowercase to an uppercase because she wanted to grab on to this concept of aristocracy which the little de, that didn't mean anything, but having that capital DE, that meant something. And so I looked at my own family and saw how people grabbed onto what today we call, false gallantry. So, I think I understood that we were going to get into a little bit of trouble, and I certainly really kind of was excited at the idea of doing a little investigative journalism. But as Brian says, everything prior to 2019 in this book is old news to people who do this for a living. The stuff from 2019 forward, we broke some news. And maybe we'll talk about that too. But I do want to point out that this is an argument. It's not a textbook. We're making a case for a point of view. You may disagree with our point of view. I respect that. I don't expect you to change your mind if you don't want to. But that's also why we made it fun. It's actually a very funny book. And it's about a lot more than just 13 days in 1836. So anyway, thank you.
Well, I think I kind of owe this whole forum and getting you all to Jason. Jason and I'm grateful. He helped me in my first campaign to run for commissioner, so thank you for helping me make history. And thank you for tonight. Jason is a writer whose bylines have appeared in Texas Monthly, the Austin American Statesman, the Los Angeles Times, MSNBC, the Texas Tribune, and Texas Highways. He's a former communications director for Austin Mayor Steve Adler. Stanford previously worked as a political consultant and helped elect or re-elect more than 30 members of Congress. He now publishes a weekly newsletter called The Experiment. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. My family came to Texas during the Civil War. Thomas Stanford was the patriarch of the family, and he was a Methodist preacher in Arkansas in a
Can you turn him up a little bit up there?
How about now? Can you hear me? All right, great. My family moved to Texas during the Civil War because Thomas Stanford, he was a Methodist preacher in a pro-Union county in Arkansas. He wanted to come to a more Confederate-friendly place, so he moved to Waco. There is still a Stanford Cemetery in McClellan County. They moved away on a cattle drive, and I moved back in 1993. And like most Gen Xers who didn't grow up in Texas, my relationship to the Alamo was defined by Pee Wee Herman. I thought it would be fun to write a book about the Alamo. And so I took the most modern part because my background's in politics, and the back third of the book is mostly about politics. What I didn't count on was how seriously I would end up taking it, for two reasons. One, starting with a little bit with Pearl Harbor, but mostly with the Vietnam War, politicians started using the Alamo to justify sending young men into combat. Why LBJ thought the Alamo was a good image to justify and to motivate Americans to support the Vietnam War is still beyond me. But he really thought, and he talked about this often, that the sacrifice of those people at the Alamo was so valorous that he thought it justified the sacrifice. And people kept using that, to the extent that we talked to Dr. Bruce Winters, who used to be the curator at the Alamo. And he said that he would have a lot of veterans come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that they called their little encampments over there the Alamo. Again, probably not the best image to use in a war overseas. So the other thing, and you referenced Project Alamo, that people keep using this to justify what they want to do. But the thing that meant the most to me was, we've referenced the historians, the Hispanic historians, as a Hispanic population that knew the truth all along. But what we didn't count on was how personally it hurt them. And we talked to a lot of people, and there's a lot of people quoted in the book, and we had to leave some out because the whole book could have been quotes like this, where they went on the field trip, and they walked in as Texans, and they came out as Mexicans. And that explained to me when I moved here why I had friends, not racist, not overt racist, not, kind of liberal friends, but they would call Hispanics Mexicans. And it puzzled me, like, how do you know they're Mexicans? He said, that the Alamo became this sorting thing, that it sorted Texans from Mexicans. And it did at the beginning, and it still does it today. And the way that Texas history has been taught over the years taught that there were good guys and bad guys, and that the Mexicans were the bad guys, and that so many kids growing up were taught, oh, Andres. People, it could have been his grandfather who killed Davy Crockett. And that became the original sin of Texas. If Texas is the creation myth of Texas, the thing that makes Texans think that this place is special and they're different than Iowans, then killing Davy Crockett for at least baby boomers became original sin. And a lot of Hispanic Texans that we talked to felt blamed by education, by field trips, for doing that. And it became very painful for them. Sometimes they would get pissed off and dedicate their lives to studying it. And then they'd write books and be promptly ignored by a popular culture. Most often they ignored it. They just checked out. We call it the heroic Anglo narrative. And it was also a narrative for Anglos that broadly in Texas and even in San Antonio, Hispanics saw that as white people's business and didn't connect it to them. A lot of times the fight to reform Texas education has been, no, write some Tejanos in as heroes. It hasn't been, maybe the story isn't good guys versus bad guys. Maybe it's different. Maybe it's more complicated. And it became to the extent where one of the guys I talked to was Thomas Loralda, Jose Menendez's chief of staff. And he said when Senator Menendez first got elected, he got a bus together of community leaders and he took them around on a tour of the district. And it was the first time a lot of those folks had ever been to the Alamo. And it's the district that includes the Alamo. And this is more than just like people living in LA and never going to Disneyland. That's yours. That's not ours. So the center of town, the Jerusalem of Texas, has been othering the dominant population in this city and largely in this state. And that's not a sustainable operation. So that's what I hope. I see that discussion happening here. I'm gratified to see so many young people, millennials and Gen Z, that this book is their first real experience with the Alamo. It's because it's also there's an age differentiation with people who really have engaged with the myth. It's really nice that I have a lot of friends who are younger than me saying that they just kind of slept through 7th grade history and they don't remember much about it, kind of like Brian. And that this book is the first time they went, oh, that's what happened. So it's gratifying to see that this is changing the conversation, and dying to hear your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I've got another round of applause. I want to ask Councilman Mario Salas, to lead the conversation, the questions. I'm going to step back a little bit, but I do want to tell you a little bit who he is. He is a civil rights leader and advocate for San Antonio's African-American community and a key member of local civil rights groups. He served on the City Council of San Antonio in 1997. He served 2 terms as representative for District 2. He has authored several textbooks, including Foundation Myth and Political Thought, The Racial Moorings of Foundation Myth. He is a retired assistant professor of political science, having taught Texas politics, federal politics, political history, the politics of Mexico, African American studies, civil rights, and international conflicts. He is a current lecturer at UTSA. Take it away, Professor.
I'd like to start off everything that I have to say with a quote from a very famous astronaut, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, and this is something we ought to all remember, quote, one of the greatest challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think that you're right, but not enough about the subject to know that you're wrong. And this is something that we all must remember when we're talking about the Alamo. I have looked at, I had to have an operation on my foot, and as a result, I was laid up from bunion surgery for 3 weeks. So I got to read about 14 books, and some of them were very painful because several of them had 2,000 and 3,000 footnotes on each one of them. And I like to read the footnotes first. So having said that, Let me recommend a few books. Aside from you got to read that one. I tell you, I read that one. I couldn't put it down because it's filled with Texas humor on top of that. It's very well done. You got to get that book if you haven't got it. Please do. The other great book as far as resources go is by Dr. Philip Tucker, The Exodus from the Alamo, The Anatomy of the Last Stand Myth. And then the gold mine of information is going to be The Alamo Reader by Todd Hansen, which is, my God, 900 pages and so forth. So please do that. Is that one better? Okay, all right, step back a little bit. Okay, so that one is better as far as the gold mine goes. And let me just say, what? Okay, can you hear me now? All right. Okay, and so one of the things that I did was make a note of how many times Mexican Americans were called derogatory terms, and the term mongrel keeps showing up over and over. The word phlegm, uttered by Sam Houston, in speaking in Corpus Christi, said, and I paraphrase, the sturdy men of the North would never mix with the phlegm of the Mexican. This is the words of Sam Houston. I also remembered the phlegm comment, the mongrel comments, the greaser comment in reference to Mexican Americans. And by the way, Mexican people are often referred to as half Indian and then the N-word right behind it. So this is the legacy of this Texas battle for independence. I am also reminded that manifest destiny played a very important role. And before that term even arose, there was another term called continentalism. And that term meant we're going to take over the United States from coast to coast. And in order to do that, we're going to slaughter all the Native Americans and replace them with slaves from Africa. And in doing so, in doing that, we are reminded of Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears and removing Native Americans from Alabama and so forth. Now, keep in mind, there was a civil war of the Creek Indians. They fought one another, two different bands, red sticks, white sticks, and those band of Indians were the ones who supported slave owners, were aided by Andrew Jackson. Sam Houston fought at that battle, and that's why he limped, because he got hit with an arrow. He fought at that battle, and there's a close relationship, which more research needs to be done, on the relationship between Andrew Jackson's push to establish slavery, the expansion of slavery across the United States by committing genocide against the Native Americans and then bringing in African slaves to do just that. So all of this is connected, and no one can tell me the Battle of the Alamo is not related to slavery. I know it was. And for those of us who lived past that time, those of us who lived in the 1960s and 70s, know what Remember the Alamo meant. It meant racist discrimination against people of color. That's what it meant. And the myth is unbelievable. Look, I went and saw I went to the Alamo at 10 years old. And I'll never forget what happened when I came out. An old man, very old man, came up to me and my father and said to us, "Everything you just heard in there is a damn lie." And he just walked off. I never forgot that. And to this day, I understand now what he meant. So we're talking about the expansion of slavery. We're talking about the murder of Native Americans. We're talking about all of that, these racist terms. By the way, several of Sam Houston's slaves escaped to Mexico because Mexico was the underground railroad for escaped slaves in the South. In the North, of course, it was Canada. So that was the underground railroad. There is enough primary source documentation to show that the Alamo, that the fight for Texas independence, and not just words coming out of abolitionists' mouth, although some people like to disregard what the abolitionists had to say, not just that, but the words themselves. This is not Professor Salas saying these things. This is them themselves admitting that this stuff was all about slavery. I'll close with this because we want to get to the audience. Anytime you talk about federalism, and a system that is opposed to monarchies, where you have more democracy, you're also talking about a system that allows slavery. Because in the founding of this country, you had a system that allowed slavery. It was democracy, but democracy for who? White men with property. That's the kind of democracy we had. It was never we the people. It meant we the ones who were white, we the ones who are men, we are the ones who own property. That's what it meant. And this continuity of white supremacy moved on into past the 13 colonies, past the American Revolution, moved on and ingrained in the minds of people to the defenders of the Alamo, to eventually to the Civil War, eventually to Jim Crow, eventually to Black Lives Matter, eventually to mass incarceration. So we ain't got over this mess yet. We got a long way to go, and the only way to get there is by telling the truth about the relationship between slavery, white supremacy, and the Alamo.
All right, thanks, Professor. We're going to get to your questions. We're opening it up. Whoever wants to start, I see a hand in the front. Go ahead.
Test.
Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Felmy Barra, and I'm here as a member of Tejano Democrats and a member of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Kudos to Tommy, Mr. Calvert, for all of your leadership. To all of the renowned authors that are here, thank you for taking the time. And Mario, nothing came up about your leadership with us now, but also back in 1972 when you ran under Raza Unida Party for state office. My comment is this: we're gonna leave in a few minutes. And as someone mentioned earlier, there are some youth in here. The most important thing, and I don't know if this is gonna hold, but that all of us need to go back to our communities with our state reps, with our school board members, our superintendents, and ask them, how many ethnic studies courses do you teach at my child's high school? How many Mexican American studies or Asian American studies, or just, we are here, we are, some of us in our 70s, but our children are the ones that are going to continue this fight through the decades. And we have to start in kinder, we need to start in 3rd grade. It should be happening now. And I'm gonna end with this. There are almost 57 high schools in this community alone. And of those 57, I don't think we even have 13 that are doing Mexican American studies and ethnic studies. Get the word to the youth. They're our hope.
Thank you, Commissioner Calvert, for hosting this tonight. I want to thank the writers of this book for affirming what I grew up with and people telling me I was crazy, you know. To the point of Mario Salas, I do the same thing to people coming out of San Fernando Cathedral. They say the tomb where the Alamo heroes are. I say, there's nobody in there. It's ashes, and it's propaganda. And they look at me like I'm crazy. I read a book 10 years ago that was given to me by Marty Tanner's husband called Exodus from the Alamo. And that was the first time that revisionist history affirmed what my father taught me and my brother. And I'm on my 3rd read of your book, by the way. And in 1973, my mom and dad brought me and my brother to San Antonio for the first time on a family vacation. We stayed at Palacio del Rio, we had ice cream at Josky's, and we walked over to the Alamo. And it was as hot as Hades. So we were very happy to be in that long building. And my brother and I were fascinated by the little toy soldiers underneath the glass. And my mom was forever my dad's translator, because my dad was a Mexican federal, Mexican citizen who refused to learn English. And my mom was a Tejana from South Texas, who taught me and my brother we could not succeed in Texas if we spoke Spanish. And so we had a very bipolar upbringing, but to our benefit. And we were in there when my mom was translating for my dad, and he kept asking my mom, ¿Qué dicen? ¿Qué dijo? And as she was retelling the history over the intercom, my brother and I felt my dad's hands on our shoulders and then on our wrists. And he dragged us out of the Alamo. And right in front of the Alamo, in front of God and all the tourists, my mom and dad got into this very heated argument. And my dad told my mom, don't you ever, all in Spanish in very colorful language, don't you ever bring my children back here where these lies are being perpetrated and told to our children. And I want them to know the true history, the Mexican history. They're half Mexican. And so from that point on, my brother and I have always searched for the truth. And I found it 10 years ago. This has affirmed what we've always known. And I bought every book you mentioned in here in chapters 22 and 23, and I can't wait to read them. And I thank you for being here today. And I hope that you have other venues to teach what's in this book to the rest of Texas and to the rest of our people who have been suppressed and have been living under the thumb of the dominant culture. The truth must prevail.
All right. Ramon.
I just want to respond real quick to that and say that it is a damn shame that it took 3 middle-aged white guys to tell this story. Okay, damn shame.
Let me just say real quick, Judge, Commissioner Ellis of Harris County called me. He said he'd be happy to host the authors in Harris County's courthouse as well.
To follow up on your remarks, I lived outside the state for way too long and came back, and this was my first project. I had no idea about how Tejanos, how Latinos felt about this. I found myself writing to myself from 2 years ago. And I was so stunned that I can remember at barbecues and dinners and everything, we were, because there's no way to scientifically do this other than take a poll, we were asking all our Anglo friends, do you understand what this narrative, the traditional Alamo narrative means for Latinos? And they were like, what do you mean? What does it mean? And there was no debate. There was just none. And so that was, at some point during the book, we started talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could help restart this conversation in a healthy, respectful way? One of the things, last thing about patting ourselves on the back, one of the things we really tried to do with the book, for those of you who haven't read it, is we really tried to make it friendly and accessible. And the furthest thing from kind of preachy in your face, if you don't agree with this, it's okay. It's fine. And it's fine if you need to believe your own narrative. But we wanted to show respect for everyone's beliefs, if you will. At least we tried to.
All right.
My name is Jose Sierra Jr. I am the spokesman for an organization called Two Countries, One Lie. And the two countries that you all are aware of are the United States and Mexico. That's what this conversation is basically around. 4 years ago, I went to the Henry B. Gonzalez Center here when they were talking about the future of the Alamo, when they've got the $500 million or whatever it was from the Heritage Foundation. And everybody was talking about turning it into Disney World. I went there, it's recorded, it's on YouTube, and I spoke. It was supposed to be 3 minutes. I spoke for about 6, 7 minutes. And what I said was this, that the Alamo was a lie 4 years ago. They were all upset. Why? Because we all know, Mexican Americans know that the Alamo is a crown jewel for the Anglo-Saxons. We all know that. The lie is that we have never been part of it as a Mexican American in this state of Texas. The reality of it is this. 3 weeks ago, now forget the 4 years, I was way ahead of you guys. You're just catching up to the Mexicans. That's all you guys are doing. 3 weeks ago, I went to the Alamo pulling a wagon. It had 2 flags. One flag was the American flag. It was upside down. The second flag was the Mexican flag. It's upside down. A sign of distress. Not illegal, but a sign of distress. I towed it over there, and on the back of my little wagon, it's on my Facebook page, by the way, Two Countries, One Lie. On the back of the wagon, it stated, "Grieve our dead." We are here to grieve our dead. What I'm about to tell you, I try to get a hold of all you guys. It's impossible to get a hold of journalists. You call their publishers, nobody, yeah, we'll leave a message. I was going to tell you, what we're about to do is going to rattle the whole Alamo. And we're going to do it legally. Because what nobody understands is there's treaties that are tied, and the Alamo is part of one. You don't even know that. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had Article 9 in it. Read it. Most people don't even know it exists. Article 9 states Mexicans. That's how it starts. There's 3 paragraphs. Article 8, Article 9, and Article 10, which was deleted because it gave guarantees and safeguards for the Spanish and Mexican land grants. And the U.S. Congress says, we don't want the Mexicans, we want their lands. They took Article 10 and deleted it, so we didn't have our lands protected. Article 9 states that the United States gave us in that treaty, Mexicans, my ancestors were here, and they were here on the grounds in 1845. The reality of it is they were told that they were going to be U.S. citizens. If Texas was a state in 1845, why in 3 years later are they asking us in a Treaty of Guadalupe, my ancestors, make a choice, either be a Mexican national or be a U.S. citizen? Why did we have to make a choice in 1848? Look it up. In 1845, Texas became a state. I've asked professors all over from New Mexico all the way everywhere I've been, and I asked them the same question. If Texas was a state in 1845, why did Mexicans have to proclaim in 1848 if we owned land? No answers. You can hear a pin drop. When you talk about the history, you haven't even touched the surface of our history of the Mexican-American indigenous person. The reality of it is, I took my little wagon to the Alamo to stand there. Never said a word to anybody. The Alamo Rangers went berserk. They came at me, they yelled at me, and they threatened me, and they took me in the back and had the San Antonio Police Department, and they were yelling, I want him arrested. This man is trespassing. Didn't do anything but hold my little wagon with the 2 upside-down flags with a sign, I'm here to grieve my dead. This is what I'm going to tell you. If you're going to hang around, because in about 2 weeks, I'm headed for the Alamo. I'm going back, and I was told if I come back, I'm going to be arrested. Even though I didn't do anything but still stood there to grieve our dead. I'm going back because Article 9 says that we have, as Mexican Americans, we have a right to the freedom of religion without restriction. That's a treaty. The U.S. Constitution only says freedom of religion. It doesn't say without restriction. But look up Article 9 and you're going to see without restriction. So
right.
if I go to grieve...
We want to get to as many people as possible.
So if I want to grieve my dead, if I want to grieve the dead, and we have relatives that are buried at the Alamo, which is a big fight going on right here in San Antonio with the Mexican-American community that nobody's even aware of.
We've got it all on recording, so we will pass it on to the historians. Thank you for your comment. Commissioner Patterson.
Yeah, good evening, and I appreciate the commissioner holding the forum. I'm Jerry Patterson. I'm the former commissioner of the General Land Office, was in charge of the Alamo for 4 years. And Chris said something that I particularly agree with, and I wanted to say that to you. We're kind of like pen pals. You know, I don't know Brian. I do know how to spell his name now. And Jason, it's my turn to buy lunch. You bought me lunch about 2 years ago and interviewed me for this book. But what you said is that those who fight the wars, and I'm a retired Marine and a Vietnam veteran, those who fight the wars, the ones with the rifle, are frequently disconnected from those who start the wars. And that's been true throughout history, but there are exceptions. And what we're talking about now is one of those exceptions. They weren't disconnected. So I've also learned in listening to y'all that I hear this is not a history. It's a popular history and it's an opinion. And we welcome other opinions. And then someone just spoke earlier and said, this is truth. Well, it's not truth. It's an opinion. It's an op-ed. And if you'll look, while you're doing additional, see those little yellow tabs? There's the things you might need to look at. But what I want to do is tell this group here tonight, I'm probably one of the few folks in this crowd that have a differing opinion, but so I think it's worthwhile that I lay some things out. And what is left out of the book is equally as important as what is in the book. And Commissioner, you started out making reference to Texas Constitution, Article 9. And what that tells me is that slavery was very important to those who wrote that document. As a matter of fact, they were probably white supremacists. As a matter of fact, virtually every white man at that time, including abolitionists by our measure today, was a white supremacist. But what the book omitted was there also was a Declaration of Independence on March the 2nd, 1836. And in that Declaration of Independence were 6 general and 14 specific causes, total of 20. Not one of them was slavery. So while it was important, it wasn't a cause of rebellion. And the reason it wasn't a cause of rebellion was that it was not in jeopardy. So the premise that this was about slavery, 1836 was about slavery, I believe, is false. The other thing, I'm shocked. Another thing that's left out is we all know about Texas. Texas rebelled in 1836, but there were at least 5 other Mexican states in rebellion at the same time. Zacatecas, which was mentioned in your book, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, Yucatan, they were all in rebellion. And none of them were slave-owning states. Could it be that there was some other major reason for rebellion of at least 6 states at the same time, only one of which is a slaveholding state? Also omitted, and I went to the index. I mean, I've read this 1.5 times and parts of it 3 or 4 times. Also omitted was siete leyes, 7 laws, which were enacted in 1835. Among those laws were an abrogation of the Constitution of 1824. Also, all the elected governors were fired, dismissed, removed, and replaced by appointed military governors. And all the legislatures of every state in Mexico was disbanded. Now, would that tend to piss you off? I think so. Would that tend to foment rebellion, not only in Texas, but in all those other states that I mentioned? Yes. So in other words, those of you who have the opinion that this was all about slavery are simply misinformed. I know how it feels. I've been misinformed quite a bit myself. And there's more, and maybe I know there's other people that want to talk. There's also, we talk about those who fought there, 200 or so, 7 of them, at least 7 were Tejanos, which interestingly enough, you say there's 200 people and only say 10 were Tejanos. That means Tejanos didn't support the rebellion. But if you ratio and proportion that to the total number of Tejanos in Texas at that time and Anglos in Texas at that time, you'll see that Tejanos were well represented on the side of rebellion. So another thing that's interesting, if all 200 over there were fighting for slavery, how do you explain the abolitionists that were present there? A Dr. Amos Pollard, a physician from Massachusetts, who was an abolitionist and had published articles in the abolitionist magazine of the day. Anyway, I may pipe up a little bit later. I don't want to take too much time. But what I'm saying is, this is an opinion. And Frank,
No, it's not.
I'll give you something.
Well,
to read.
hold on. We
And
want to be
one more
respectful
thing.
of all opinions.
I have
I want to be respectful of all
100
opinions.
documents that I'll share with those who outline much more if you'd like to see me when this is over. And thank you for allowing me to speak.
Of course,
I think this
Commissioner.
is the first time somebody has stood up in front of these gentlemen who write very well, I might add, and had a differing opinion.
I
Thank you.
appreciate the dialogue. Councilman Salas, you want to start?
Yeah. Let me address a few misconceptions the gentleman has. Number one, let me work off of that one. Number one, anytime a white supremacist writes a...
Well, no, he's signaling to be further apart, so we're getting different signals.
All right, how about now?
Okay, good. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Anytime white supremacy has written a constitution, they purposely remove references to slavery. The best example of that is the U.S. Constitution that removed references to slavery, and they talk about other people instead of using the word slavery. So this is purposely done, purposely done. The other thing that's purposely done is not understanding that federalism under a rule of white supremacy is quite simply a way to hide slavery, so that no one can, me most of all, I don't agree with monarchies at all, but by the same token, I don't like slavery, racism, and white supremacy hidden in a constitution that proclaims to be democratic. And the Mexican Constitution of 1824 did just that. It never mentioned slavery so that it could allow the states, the independent 31 states or whatever it was at the time of Mexico, allow them the possibility to have slavery. Very shrewd maneuver on the part of the people that write these constitutions. By the way, I pulled the document that the gentleman was referring to about the abolitionists. Amos Pollard, all he did was write a letter to the Liberator, to Lord Garrison's newspaper. It doesn't prove he's an abolitionist, I can tell you that. But he just says, you know, that Americans ought to come to Texas. And then he contradicts himself in a roundabout way by saying that cotton production and tobacco production is really great here, so y'all need to come. When every fool knows that cotton production was done by slaves. So Mr. Amos Pollard he's either a very shrewd doctor, because he was a physician at the time. He's either a very shrewd doctor that knows how to play this game of white supremacy, or he's confused. And that brings me to the point of people who fight for the wrong side are confused. Somebody asked me one time, should we go and honor the people that fought for the Confederacy? I don't think they would want to be bothered once they knew that they fought for the wrong side. So there's an example of that. People often do get tricked, do get brainwashed, and this thing in the Liberator, all it is a letter to the editor and nothing else. So I think I'm done with that. And let me just end with this. Opinions are one thing, true. However, some opinions are well-reasoned, and some opinions are willy-nilly. I know the difference between a well-reasoned opinion, as these gentlemen have done, and a willy-nilly sticking. You know, I got more postums stuck in my Forget the Alamo book than he has. So it's not just an opinion, it's based on primary source documentation. And that's real simple. Go look it up instead of just having a willy-nilly opinion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Henry Rodriguez. I'm the executive director for LULAC, Concilio Zapatista. And no testimony here. I am just going to give an invite, and that's that we're taking this program to the West Side on August the 12th, 6 p.m. at the Progreso Hall. And I just want to say one thing. At the time, cotton was gold, and whoever picked it, they wanted cheap labor. This was not cheap labor. This was free labor because the slaves picked it and they treat them real bad. So, I mean, that is the truth. So I invite each and every one of you to come to on the 12th, 6 p.m. and invite some more people. The place is much bigger. This is beautiful. Thank you. And I want to invite our Commissioner Tommy to come and help us set the tone for our program. Thank you so much.
To Mr. Salazar, and thank you to your son, the sheriff, who helped keep us safe today, and all of his deputies.
Okay, well, too bad Mr. Patterson obviously or apparently took off right after he got through telling us about
He's doing an interview outside.
this opinion. Is he still around?
He's outside doing an interview with Texas Public Radio.
I can't turn my neck because of some injuries that I got defending our country in Vietnam. I've got a titanium plate in there, but okay, he says this is an opinion. Well, what the hell do you call what we've been learning at our public schools all this time? Isn't it about time that we hear a different opinion that at least includes some of our heroes? Some of our heroes. For example, there is one in particular, a guy Gabaldon from California. He was denied the Medal of Honor, although he by himself captured or killed twice as many enemy combatants as Audie Murphy and Sergeant York put together. Put that in the history books. We have fought time and time and time again, days on end, and I do mean days on end, because we had to be at the State Board of Education by 7 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes they would not let us speak until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. That included Dr. C.P. Garcia, who was 92 years old at the time. He was a hero. He was a World War II hero. His brother, Dr. Hector P. Garcia, was a hero. But it took us, I don't know how long, before we got Dr. Hector P. Garcia's name in the history books. We only have about 2 or 3 people in there, so I'm sorry? They took him out? Well, so much for that. But isn't it about time we got our history told, even if it's our opinion? What the hell is wrong with the opinion that's in there right now? Throw it out. Burn all those history books. They are lies.
Commissioner, thank you very much for those great remarks. And also, congratulations for bringing this to the community. I think this will begin the dialogue of talking about the Alamo. I think a new dimension has been added about slavery being the reason for the Alamo, for the battle. So we're going to be very involved in discussing the Alamo in at least for the next year or two. Now, you gave us $25 million so that we could be part of it. And I want to thank you for doing that. And we're going to be very much involved in the discussions. And one question that I want to ask Chris, where did you get that information from that you put in the book that people are disputing? Where did you get it from?
I mean, Jerry and I have been going back and forth by email quite a bit. I've replied to all of the concerns that he has sent me. You mean about the slavery or about what?
No, about what you put in the book and forget the Alamo.
Well, I mean, we have 326 endnotes. We went through a wide variety of original source material, also secondary material. But you know, when Stephen F. Austin spells it out that the only way the Texas economy can survive is with slaves, and that the end of slavery would be the end of Texas, and that's why he was begging the Mexican government to give Texas a special exception for slavery. That started in 1824 and lasted for 12 years. There was 12 years that Austin and other Anglos were fighting for slavery. There are hundreds of letters, hundreds of documents. It's indisputable that that was the basic underlying cause of the conflict. Now, I agree with Jerry in that, no, slavery was not 100% the cause of this conflict. The suspension of the Constitution of 1824 was why Juan Seguin wanted to raise an army to put down Santa Anna months before the Anglos decided to take up weapons. It's why the Zacatecas and the people in Tamaulipas were fighting, but they weren't fighting to separate their land from Mexico. They were fighting as patriots for their country. They were not trying to take their provinces, their states, out of the nation of Mexico. And I think that's That's a critical difference between what was happening in those other states. So, I mean, the documents are there. And as I like to say, you know, all we've done is we've shifted the perspective so that it's not the 100% focused on the Anglo so-called heroes and expanding that picture to a wider, more panoramic perspective. And when you do that, then suddenly the young men rushing the walls of the Alamo on behalf of Santa Anna to defend their sovereign nation from being split apart by foreign invaders who'd crossed the border illegally, the day that we can honor those Mexican soldiers as having fought for their country with bravery as much as we honor the people who fought from within the Alamo, then I think we can start having a conversation about reconciliation and an honest accounting.
One more question that I had.
Real quick, Nick, because I want to get to Rick Casey.
Real quick, Mario, you made some real strong statements concerning disputing Mr. Patterson. Now, Patterson probably has documents to support his statement. Do you have some of those?
I've got plenty of documents, and they're not mine. They're primary source documents that deal with slavery. They're documents that show that Stephen F. Austin, and here is his quote, this is not coming from me, this is Stephen F. Austin saying Texas must be a slave country, okay? Yeah, there's microphones. Texas must be a slave country. That's Stephen F. Austin talking. That's not me. So there's enough documentation in the primary source records to show that all of this has a relationship directly with slavery and white supremacy, even more so in many other ways as well. So I don't think the book is opinion. I think the book is based on primary source documentation. Opinion, as I said before, can be willy-nilly or can be well documented. And then in this book, forget the Alamo, it is well documented. There's no document, there's no doubt about that.
Okay, we're going to have, I'm going to take two more questions, and then I want to give a bit of housekeeping before Rick asks his question. There are nameplates available this evening for purchase and to take to the author's table after this presentation for their signatures. You can purchase those nameplates, and the authors will sign them. They'll keep the nameplate and put it in the book when your book arrives. So the nameplates are for online purchases. They'll be available when the books arrive. We apologize that the bookstore couldn't get the books in here, but the order forms are on the chairs. If your book is not picked up in the store, there is a free delivery available only in San Antonio. Deliveries outside of San Antonio will have a fee that will be at the time of the purchase at the Twig table in front. So if you want to get a nameplate, you can do that. Rick, good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Good to see you, Commissioner. It's good that you mentioned Dan Patrick. I think he's largely responsible for the fact that there are no books available here tonight. And I want to ask you, is it true that he's asked you for part of your royalties? And if so, don't you think you do owe a part of them to him?
The mic wasn't quite, it couldn't quite
wasn't
hear,
on.
but we could hear because we're up front. Can you, is the power on?
My question was whether Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick asked them, if it's true that he asked them for a part of their royalties, having promoted their book so effectively. And secondly, don't they owe him some of it? And I have one follow-up question, very briefly.
You know, I'm frankly, I'm done laughing at the Dan Patrick joke, Rick, and let me explain why. I had a Congolese colonel beat the crap out of me in Goma, Zaire, because I was reporting for Voice of America, and he didn't like a story I had done about how his troops were raping refugees. So when he saw me, he grabbed me by the neck, threw me to the ground, and kicked the crap out of me. And so I take freedom of speech is something that is sincerely very important to me. And this idea that somehow I profited because an elected official violated my First Amendment rights by canceling my ability to give a talk in public, I'm done laughing about that.
On a more, and clearly he did it as a government actor, which
No, he made it clear. He said, I used my power as an elected official to take away a United States citizen's right to speak at a public institution.
Yeah.
And as our letter from our attorneys to the Bullock and to, which is public, it was crafted by the ACLU, makes perfectly clear, there is hundreds of precedents that make such an action a violation of his oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and he should be ashamed for it. And those who actually think he did the right thing should be ashamed for not understanding what it means to be a U.S. citizen.
on a more serious note, he did try and save some face by suggesting that you three should have some conference together with what he considered to be real historians, presumably under the misimpression that those historians would show the lie of what you've done. Has any move been made in that direction?
Yeah, I'll just answer that very quickly. And I would just say, if you want to heckle me, go for it. Continue on, young lady. You may heckle me all you want. Because apparently that's the only way you feel comfortable expressing yourself. We have been contacted by the University of Texas President's Office, and we're waiting. I've spoken to them, and they said they're going to get back to us. So I'm waiting to hear.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Deborah, the CEO and director of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. This was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Commissioner Calvert, and for everyone that is here tonight. What I just want for people to think about, so often history is written from the perspective of the colonizer. And what has happened in the last 30 years is that historians have come to the table and said, let's not do this anymore. We have primary sources, newspaper articles, census records, all of that, where we can put together the real story. So kudos for doing your homework and creating a book that will at least create some dialogue so we can talk about what really happened at the Alamo. Thank you.
Well, this forum was only scheduled to go to 8:30. It's 8:35. We're going to allow you to get your books signed. I hope you don't mind. As a point of personal privilege, I'm going to ask that mine be the first. So thank you all for coming.